Hello, Canada. Welcome to Ecofiscal Commission's latest hangout. My name is Chris Reagan. I am a McGill University economics professor by day, and by night I put on a cape and I chair the Ecofiscal Commission in its fight for good economic and environmental policy. Today, we have released our latest report. Our latest report is called Supporting Carbon Pricing, and it's about all of those other policies that governments might choose to operate alongside their economy-wide carbon price. When we think about this, there's actually kind of an interesting debate among people that are even strong advocates of carbon prices. Some people say all you need is a well-designed carbon price, and then you let the market work its magic, and we'll see emissions fall in a cost-effective way. Other people say, well, you need the carbon price, but you need lots of other things too, and the more, the better. At Ecofiscal, we weren't quite sure where the truth was, and so we decided to figure it out. And that's what this report is all about. This report is designed to offer a coherent framework to governments to help them think through and identify and design policies that are both effective but also cost effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that they enhance the operation of their carbon price. But this framework also is important in helping governments identify those policies that might weaken the carbon price's signal, may undermine the functioning of the carbon price, and frankly are probably left in the dust heap. So we think it's as important to eliminate bad policies as it is to introduce good ones. So that's what this report is all about. Now, ordinarily in our Ecofiscal Hangouts, I am the moderator and we invite guests to discuss and debate the issue, but we're going to do something a little differently today. I am actually going to be one of four discussants or debaters or combatants, and what we're going to have today is an outsider, an objective, neutral outsider who's going to moderate the debate. And that's Sean McCarthy. Now, Sean McCarthy, you probably know, is the global energy reporter for the Globe and Mail. He writes on various aspects of the energy world, from oil and gas production to development of new technologies. He used to be the Globe correspondent in New York City. Before that, he was the parliamentary bureau chief. He's been at the Toronto Star. He's been kind of all over the place, frankly, writing about these kinds of issues, certainly lately. And so I'm going to just turn this over to Sean. He is going to be the moderator and a rule keeper, and I am just going to be a well-behaved discussant. So Sean McCarthy, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Chris, and I will be the rule keeper, but as far as I know, there are not a lot of rules, and I doubt you'll be the well-behaved discussant. So, but we will launch in with Chris and three others. I'll introduce them off the top, and then they're each going to take a couple minutes to lay out their initial position. Then we'll take about a half hour for a moderated discussion among the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to your questions. And people have been submitting questions, and we invite you to continue to do that as the conversation unfolds. So first of all, you've met Chris. We also have Erin Flanagan from the Pembina Institute. Erin is the Program Director of Federal Policy for Pembina. She appears regularly on national current affairs programs and is often somebody that people like myself go to for well-informed and intelligent comment on the issues of the day with regards to environment. In 2016, she was named one of Canada's top 30 under 30 in sustainability by the Corporate Knights. So welcome, Erin.
Thanks for having me.
Ken Green is, excuse me, Senior Director for the Center for Natural Resource Studies at the Fraser Institute. 20 years in public research policy, including at the Reason Foundation, the Environmental Literacy Council, and the American Enterprise Institute. A doctorate in environmental science and engineering from UCLA, and Ken comes to us from
Calgary.
From Calgary?
Yep.
All right.
Calgary.
Welcome, Ken. Marc is a professor for Energy and Materials Research Group at the Simon Fraser University, just outside of Vancouver. He was named a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2009 and British Columbia's Academic of the Year in 2008. In 2006, his book, Sustainable Fossil Fuels, won the Donner Prize for top policy book in Canada, which is a nice feat. Marc has been a long time academic in this area and has advised governments on a number of policy fronts when it comes to carbon pricing. And Chris, you've met, is chair of the Canada's Ecofiscal Commission and associate professor of economics at McGill. He's the author of Economics, one of the leading textbooks for basic economics, introductory economics in Canada. So with that, I'm going to invite Chris, since you held the pen, so to speak, on the report. Why don't you launch with 2 minutes, and then we'll give the others an opportunity to give a 2-minute commentary, if you will, on the report itself.
Right. Great. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you everybody for joining us here. So my opening comments will be brief. To me, first and foremost, government should be encouraged across this country to put in place well-designed, economy-wide or broad-based carbon prices. I think the logic and the evidence from here and elsewhere is pretty clear that suggests that carbon pricing, because it's flexible, because it harnesses the power of markets, and for people to make decisions in a very flexible way within those market settings, it is the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over time. So not only should governments have those carbon prices and well-designed ones, but they should let that carbon price rise gradually but significantly over time. To me, that's the first thing. What's really new in this report is that it admits that carbon pricing probably can't do it all. Most carbon prices are designed to actually not apply to all emissions. In BC, for example, only 70% are covered. In Quebec, only 85% are covered. Well, sometimes this is a political decision, but sometimes it's let's call it a technical decision, because the emissions may be difficult to measure, difficult to price. So there are reasons why you want to actually have an other policy sitting beside or alongside your carbon price. And these are things that in the report we call a gap filler. So I think government should be encouraged to look for those gaps, make sure they're genuine gaps and that a price actually wouldn't work, and then design a low-cost policy to fill those gaps. The federal methane regs that just were released recently is a case study that we talk about in the report, and it is an example of those gap fillers. A second problem that we talk about are market imperfections. So, in textbook land, a carbon price applies to emissions, it sends the market signal, and you're away to the races. But sometimes there are market barriers or imperfections that actually weaken the signal that comes from a carbon price. So you might imagine that people don't switch to more efficient electric appliances just because there's the carbon price. They need to know actually which appliances are more efficient and over what time frame. So the provision of information might actually be an example of something that what we call boosts the signal of a carbon price. And so in the report, we talk about Quebec EV subsidies, electric vehicle subsidies, as an example of a signal boosting policy, but as it turns out, one that ends up being very high cost and therefore I think not worth pursuing. The final thing I'll say just very quickly is that there's a third type of policy that is what we call a benefit expander, which is a policy that not only reduces greenhouse gases, but it brings some other benefit to the table, like improved urban mobility or less air pollution and therefore better health outcomes. And what governments need to do is include all of those benefits in their calculus, not just the GHG reductions. So we think that there is a case for governments to actually design complementary policies. We think it's not an easy thing to do. We think they need to be very careful in how they kind of rationalize these policies. Not anything works. So it should be a gap filler or a signal booster or a benefit expander. But once you've got that, you can then do the work, do the analysis, make sure that it's cost effective, and then you can add it to the overall policy package. So not everything in addition to the carbon price, just carefully selected and well-designed complementary policies. Thank you.
Very good, Chris. And I'm sure we'll get into a discussion of some examples of each of those kinds of policies and where they're appropriate and where they're not, in your view, and in the view of the panelists. So let's move to Aaron. Give us your 2-minute take on the report and whether whether Ecofiscal has essentially described the proper way of viewing complementary policies.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, and Ecofiscal Commission, thanks for putting this research out today. I think it makes an important contribution to the debate, and this is really the exact kind of conversation we need to be having as a country. What type of policy mix will allow us to achieve our targets and to be a good global citizen on the issue of climate change? So just off the top, the Pembina Institute's position is that, of course, carbon pricing is a fantastic tool in our toolkit to achieve those climate targets. We know now that 86% of Canadians live in a jurisdiction with a carbon price, and that number will go up to 100 next year when the federal government introduces its national carbon pricing benchmark. So we're moving in the right direction, and this is absolutely something that we are very proud to see and we're very supportive of. That being said, we take a broader view on what Canada's obligations are under the Paris Agreement. We have a nationally determined contribution, that's our target. That's to reduce our emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. We know that the Pan-Canadian Plan makes a sizable contribution towards that target, but even still there are gaps under that plan to hit that target. And our obligation doesn't end there. Really, this is about mid-century decarbonization, so getting to near zero emissions by 2050. Carbon pricing is one important tool that will help us get there, but at the current moment, we don't have sufficient prices in place to allow us to simply rely on that measure. We need other well-designed measures to help us get there. So we take a view that it's an important tool in the toolkit, but that it's unlikely to allow us to get to our targets on its own. And so it's therefore entirely appropriate for governments to think about other types of regulations or strategies that they may want to bring into place to allow us to hit those ultimate goals.
All right, Aaron, thanks very much. Ken, I would imagine your view is somewhat different than Aaron's, so why don't you give us a quick overview of your take on the Ecofiscal report on complementary policies.
Certainly, and as every picnic needs its skunk, that's probably going to be partly my role here today. I want to start off by saying I'm fully cognizant of the argument that in a textbook situation, and Chris's whiteboard behind him, you can map out a carbon tax or carbon price that is both efficient in an economic sense and economically benign. The conditions for that, however, are very, very stringent. You can't have regulation over the same carbon sources, for example. You can't add new in without distorting the economy and losing the efficiency of the measure. You can't exempt certain industries without undercutting the efficiency of the measure. You can't use the tool for social engineering by giving the revenues to special interest groups and not redistributing it per person in a revenue neutral way. And as I wrote in a paper not long ago, all 4 governments in Canada have failed at this dismally. One, British Columbia, at least made a pretense of going for British revenue neutrality in the beginning. They wandered away from it. We pointed that out. They wandered back into it, but they still have about 12% of their revenues diverted to boutique tax credits for rural communities, children's groups, theater groups, entertainment groups, things like that. And so, and the other 3 provinces that implemented pricing didn't even make a pretense of doing it in a revenue neutral way or striking redundant regulations. And so I've proposed to people who are advocates of carbon pricing that I would make the grand trade of carbon pricing and let the market decide for regulation. In fact, I even have a roadmap to do it. Take an existing regulation, tell me how many tons it reduces in greenhouse gas emissions. We put that to a social cost of carbon, a median social cost of carbon, and we incrementally add to the tax as we kill the other regulations. Barring that, I don't support pricing because we've seen zero evidence. In fact, we've seen 100% counter evidence that governments in Canada will implement anything like a textbook or a beneficent, economically benign carbon tax. And I don't think, therefore, the benefits of going this route exceed the costs, which is the first test of public policy. And I don't think it does so individually, and I don't think it does so socially. So that's my quick skunking of the picnic from the 100th to the 30,000 foot level. Happy to get into details.
Very good, thanks. And we'll talk more about if not pricing, then where would you come down on complementary policies and that side of the equation. But Marc, over to you.
Thanks, Sean. I was both educated and somewhat frustrated by this report. On the education side, there are good things to say. First, the report provides a valuable and clear update of the complex of Canadian climate policies at provincial and federal levels, including recent studies of many of these. So this is going to be a great reference for us policy experts and the consultants working for governments and industry and non-government organizations and us academics. And second, the report presents a coherent analytical framework for assessing climate policies. So even if I didn't always agree with the substantive commentary, which I'll comment on, I really enjoyed chapter 4, and I'm going to be recommending that chapter to others to use as a policy assessment framework. Some excellent texts and graphics too. So my hat's off to Chris and the rest of the team. I think a lot of work went into that. On the frustration side, I don't have time in this opening to go into detail, so I'll just make a general point. The report's economist authors are religiously devoted to explicit emissions pricing, and you just heard that from Chris. And in my view, that makes them blind to strong evidence about the climate policymaking challenge that other social scientists have been pointing to for decades. Namely, that even well-meaning policymakers have been politically constrained from raising explicit carbon prices to levels that reflect the likely full social cost of carbon, and which the US EPA acknowledges, looking at its own numbers, is going to be higher significantly than the value it uses. The ecofiscal authors say that, quote, a carbon price must be the centerpiece of climate policy, end quote. So why is that? Well, it's economically efficient. So how do we know? Well, they compare it to command and control regulations. The example they use is on page 2. But I'm wondering, why didn't they compare the carbon tax to the next best flexible regulation? And I don't know the answer to that, but I have suspicions. Because in my own research team, when we've done this, we find, for example, that if you're getting to the major reductions that Aaron is talking about, a low carbon fuel standard with all of its flexibilities in transportation that achieved the same 80% emission reductions as a carbon tax would have almost identical economic efficiency performance. And I've been one of many who have been trying to get the Ecofiscal Commission to be willing to look at those things. I thought I might see it in this report, and I didn't. So this report congratulates Canadian politicians on following the Ecofiscal Commission's advice by implementing carbon pricing, and then, yes, adding some regulations that may or may not complement it and may or may not be economically efficient. But actually, this is not what's happening. Canadian policymakers, just like California's policymakers, are relying on regulations to reduce most emissions with carbon pricing in a marginal role. I and others predicted this for Canada over a year ago, and this is exactly what is happening. The carbon price is at marginal levels. It's slated to stay there, at least in the time frame we're talking about, and the heavy lifting is going to be done by regulations which the government has now been rolling out on methane, coal phase out, clean fuels, zero emission vehicles, and so on. And it seems that the political reasons the government is doing this are obvious to all but the Ecofiscal Commission. Thank you.
All right. That'll lead us to conversation, I think. So let's start with the framework that is in front of us, I guess, which is the Pan-Canadian framework. Does that have the right trade-off in your views between carbon pricing and other measures, other regulatory measures? And just by way of introducing the subject, I will mention that, or point out, I suppose, that we have a plan to 2030 except on the price. On the price, we have a plan to 2022, which takes us to $50. We don't know what's going to happen after that. Presumably, if governments were going to be consistent, that price would increase over time. So, I mean, you can either address the question in that presumption of an increasing carbon price, moderately increasing over time, or whatever worldview you'd like to take on it. But Chris, why don't you jump in and I think you probably have some answer to Marc, and then invite others to respond as well.
Okay, so I thank you very much, and thank you all for your comments. So I've just written down on my piece of paper some agreements that I have with what I've heard, but also some disagreements. So let me just give you, and I'm not going to give them all right now, but let me just start, I guess, with Marc Jackard. I want to agree and disagree with two different things. Where I agree is his emphasis on flexibility. So Marc was saying that flexible and well-designed regulations, and he said, could be almost as low cost as a carbon price. And I think he's absolutely right. And one of the things we talk about in this report is if you're going to have complementary policies that sit beside your carbon price, you want to make them flexible across agents, flexible across technologies, flexible across time, and that flexibility tends over time to drive down the costs associated with those policies. So I completely agree with Marc on the importance of flexibility when you're looking at non-pricing regulations. Where I disagree, and here I admit that I'm on slightly less firm ground, but Marc claims that it's basically politically infeasible to have a rising carbon price. But I actually think this is, I'm not sure that that is really, I'm not sure that we really have the evidence for that yet, because I think it's still early days. And when people say to me, you know, we can't have a carbon price that high, I think what they've got to think about is how are we going to recycle the revenues? And that's going to really be important for driving the economic benefits and, I would argue, the political feasibility. So when a politician says to me, we can't have a carbon price that high, I say, why can't we have income taxes that low? And that actually connects then to something that Ken said. So those are my agreements and disagreements with Marc. Next time I'll say something about Ken and then Aaron. Is that okay for now, Sean?
That's good for now. Who would like to jump in? Aaron?
Sure, yeah, I can maybe just offer some thoughts. So first, just a quick reaction, Chris, to the comments that you've just shared. Of course, there's a difference between a rising carbon tax or a rising carbon price and a sufficiently high price to achieve our targets. And I think what we're really talking about is the difference between those two scenarios. Because we do have a rising carbon price, and as Sean, as you mentioned, we will until 2022. In terms of our assessments of the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework, I mean, we think that much of the PCF passes the test that Ecofiscal has outlined here today in terms of making carbon pricing the centerpiece and then bringing in other policies that allow us to get at other co-benefits or address other failures like the methane coverage failure that's already been mentioned. So when we look at the Pan-Canadian Framework, we see that governments are sensitive to the question of cost effectiveness. We see that they are taking that into account, and the 11 of the 13 provinces and territories who have signed on to this agreement clearly are thinking about getting that balance right. You know, when we were going into the First Minister's meeting in December, we had outlined a number of expectations. That included things like having all sectors of the economy contribute. So in addition to getting the balance right in terms of carbon pricing and complementary measures, we're also hoping to see all regions of Canada participate. We're hoping to see all sectors of Canada's economy participate as well. And so I think that there's certainly more that Canada can be doing to address predominantly its two big sources of emissions, which are the oil and gas sector and the transportation sector. But in terms of an initial foray into this pan-Canadian approach, I think what we've got before us is really a historic and very strong contribution.
Okay, great, Aaron. Thanks very much. And Ken, you spoke with some passion about the shortcomings of carbon pricing. Would you propose alternatives? How would you assess the road that we are on to date?
Well, I would make a few points. The first is, to Erin's point, I would actually agree that to achieve the Paris targets, the commitments that Canada made, would require an extremely, extremely large carbon tax. You might be able to rebate all of it and eliminate all other taxes and still go high. What I favor is carbon pricing that actually lets the individual consumer express their value for emitting greenhouse gases and thereby seek the most efficient ways to reduce them in the economy without other ancillary policies. But what I would say is the way we've seen it implemented suggests there really is no difference in the efficiency of carbon pricing as opposed to Chris or Marc's your low carbon fuel standards, which we have, by the way, and so does the United States, or other regulations such as the methane regulations that were mentioned. Because they're being implemented so poorly, carbon pricing is no different than that. So I guess I would say, if it was up to me, I would, as I said, go for the big swap. Let's get rid of regulations pound for pound of carbon emissions and let the market find what that value is. But that also allows for the potential of carbon emissions to actually go up, not down, which is why you have to have which is why advocates of serious greenhouse gas reductions want the full panoply of options, all of them expressed immediately. Personally, I think that would break Canada's bank. I think it would make us completely non-economically compatible or competitive or viable in world markets. I think it would. I think taxpayers would rebel. In fact, polls of what people are willing to pay for carbon reduction are nowhere close, not even vaguely close to $50 a ton or $50 a year for that matter. And so I think to a certain extent that we're going down the wrong pathway of piling on measure after distorting measure after distorting measure. And Canada's economy is not going to withstand that long, especially if the United States, that 350 million people to the south, are not going in the same direction. And in fact, they're going in the direction of tax reform. The latest tax bills have the corporate tax rate in the United States dropping to 15%. And we're going to raise carbon taxes across the country significantly on top of regulations and on top of higher income taxes and corporate taxes and sales taxes and GST and PST and so forth. I think it's a mistaken path.
All right, very good. I don't think we want to get into a debate on the fundamentals of whether we want a climate change policy that will approach our Paris targets. We could argue that, I think, for more than an hour. Appreciate your point of view on that. But if we could, Marc, let me ask you to address, since you raised the possibility of economically efficient policies. Where do you see those policies as being the most promising, and how do you assess the report today in terms of creating a benchmark for Marc?
So the report gives, it tries to probe and has these concepts, gap filling, so where it might be hard to measure certain emissions, signal boosting, so something that somehow is complementary to a carbon price, and then co-benefits. So it has these examples of the methane regulations, the coal phase out, and electric vehicles. And I actually take issue with what the report says there. So people say we've got to have these complementary policies. So Erin, this might even surprise you. I actually don't believe you need complementary policies. So here I am talking about complementary policies because I think there's a political reason why you need them. We need to be honest and mature about how democratic societies try to make really difficult decisions in what is a global collective action problem. And oh my goodness, because otherwise I would kind of agree with Ken that in methane emissions in British Columbia, when we put the carbon tax in, we could have put it on methane emissions. I mean, if you can measure methane emissions to regulate them, you can measure them to price them. So I feel it's a bogus argument. Oh, we can't put the carbon tax everywhere. The second one is coal phase out. If the carbon tax is rising fast enough, and your own report says so, the coal will phase out, and it'll happen in some way, mix of natural gas, renewables, whatever. And then finally, even with electric vehicles, it talked about network externalities. The idea, yes, we have natural monopoly market failure. I used to regulate natural monopolies, but even those kinds of networks, if the price signal is good enough, they get built. So I would argue there is no economic rationale for anything other than carbon pricing. So all we should be doing is carbon pricing if we lived in a perfect world, which Ken seems to think we live in, but we don't. And so we actually live in a world where we have to do difficult things, and they may not be what works out in that board behind Chris in the ivory tower. That I'm in an ivory tower, he's not. So
Okay, can I get in there?
I intend to stop right now. So my point is that those are, I've said something for everybody. Those arguments for complementary measures are mostly bogus in my view. You could do it all with a carbon tax, and the only reason you wouldn't is because we, humanity, can't handle this global collective action problem and make decisions within jurisdictions. Okay, I'm out.
Can I jump in?
No.
Okay, so I think this is fascinating. I did not anticipate this from Marc Jackert. So Marc Jackert has just basically told us that there are political imperfections, effectively, so we can't use the lowest cost policy called a carbon price. So we're forced to use higher cost policies that should still be, you know, as well designed as possible. But he's basically said there are no economic imperfections at all. And now I actually, I don't believe that there are imperfections in markets around every corner, but I actually do believe that there are some things where a carbon price doesn't work that well. I'm not claiming that there's huge numbers of them, but I do think that there are situations where policies can enhance the functioning of the carbon price. So when we talk about EV subsidies, now, our analysis suggests that the EV subsidies in Quebec are logically, kind of their heart is in the right place logically. They're trying to get around some market imperfections that weaken the take-up of EVs, but they end up being very expensive policies. So our conclusion is those EV subsidies in Quebec are a bad idea because they're high cost. The federal methane regulations as a gap filler are very low cost. And in fact, what we say, and we kind of agree with Marc here, that most of the coal would phase down automatically in Alberta as a function of the carbon price. So you might not need the coal phase out itself. But I don't believe that there are zero market imperfections. I really don't believe Marc thinks that either. Just if I've got 30 more seconds, I want to disagree slightly with Ken as well. But also agree with him. He talked about the need to repeal bad policies as part of a grand trade. I agree completely. I think this is an important recommendation from our report that says once you've got a carbon price in place, then you want to really think about some of those other policies that you either have on the books, maybe for years, or are thinking about. And if they are high cost policies, which probably comes from them being inflexible and poorly designed, then get rid of them. Getting rid of bad policies is easily as important as introducing good policies. But where I disagree with Ken is his belief that it's just gotta be revenue neutral. Like as a taxpayer, I like this concept. As a voter, I like this concept, fair enough. But there is no deep economic theorem out there that says that a reduction in a personal income tax is necessarily better than rebuilding the Turcotte interchange in Montreal, which happens to be crumbling by the day, by the ton. So there are ways to recycle revenue that can generate economic benefits. And I think it's difficult to make that assessment, but I don't think there's a deep economic theorem that says it must be revenue neutral.
All right, Aaron, I know you want to jump into it. So, Aaron.
Yeah, so there's lots flying around to respond to. Maybe I'll just make a couple points because I think the central conversation that's emerging here is, are we going to use the most efficient instrument to its full potential? Or are we going to generate the...
We just lost Aaron.
Going to look like? I mean, I think that there's one point here that's really worth considering, which is around path dependency. So a number of our provincial governments already have significant regulations in place. And I think that we need to be mindful of that. There is a cost also of rolling back regulations. And so when I think about what an ideal solution looks like, I think we need to build on the best policies that we have in place. We need to strive for cost-effective opportunities, and we need to make sure that we're doing what we can to have a system that is coherent across borders and with the international context. But we can't just assume that all of the existing policies that are in place will be rolled back, because I just don't think that that's something that many of our governments will consider.
Aaron,
I also want to talk about sort of just two other quick points if I can. One is the role of government in buying down risk. So we're talking about the electric vehicle subsidy program as potentially an example of something that's too costly. But what about the booming market for electric vehicles worldwide? And what about Canada's role in that? Is there a role for our governments to ensure that we have a piece of that action over time? I think that subsidizing certain types of technologies or creating a regulatory pull for clean solutions can put Canada at a competitive advantage. It's worth considering that. And then just the last point I'll make is around redundancy. So the report talks quite a lot about overlapping regulations being something that's too costly. Let's just bring in the political lens again as well. Unfortunately, climate change is still somewhat of a partisan football, and I think there's some wisdom in having some redundancy across orders of government, given that governments may change and move forward with an anti-climate agenda. So having a federal coal phase-out regulation in place and also having a coal phase-out in motion in Alberta, I think makes it much more likely that we are going to get those significant co-benefits for communities and for people. So redundancy has quite an important value in terms of our political ecosystem.
Ken, go ahead.
So first I need to flog a study we did, Ross McKittrick did for the Fraser Institute, looking at whether or not anything was achieved with the coal phase out in Ontario of significance with regard to human health and public health, and looked at air pollution data going back to the 1970s and found that in fact 90% of the vast overwhelming majority of the reductions in Ontario that got rid of bad air days came because the United States implemented new standards on its coal power emissions at the time, because they overwhelmingly were the dominating factor in Ontario. But separate, I find myself quite amused to be agreement with Marc as much as I am. And where I disagree with Chris is that, you know, let's be honest, the governments across Canada and the federal government have done virtually zero analysis or released virtually zero analysis on any of these measures, whether they're the adjunct measures or the carbon price itself. This has been done by political fiat for political purposes. And to respond to Marc's point, I totally agree with him. We need to be mature about this and admit that if the government tried to put a price on carbon at the high end of the social cost of carbon estimates by Pembina and others, the public would never accept it. So they hide the ball. They hide the ball in housing efficiency regulations. They hide the ball in appliance efficiency regulations. They hide the ball in water restrictions, which really are saving energy by not moving as much water. They hide the football in 1,000 different ways that we already have on the books that are redundant, that really their purpose is to reduce energy use. And so I like the idea of having a carbon tax and none of these other things for a different reason than Marc, which is I think it would make clear to people, it would send to the actual cost of going down Aaron's pathway of decarbonization by 2050 or in the near term. And I think they deserve to actually know that cost. I think they deserve to know it, they deserve to see it, and they deserve the right to vote for politicians and decide, okay, maybe I don't value that 1/10 of a degree of averted warming in 2100 as much as the 500% tax hike you're going to give me over the next 10 years. They should be able to know that, and they should be able to see it, and they should be able to vote, express their democratic franchise and economic franchise and their feet, and decide what they think about it, which is why I support Marc's idea, which, sure, do the price, but get rid of the rest. And I would have liked to have seen that done incrementally, as I said, based on analysis, as Chris said, of is an electric vehicle subsidy of $14,000 sane? I don't think so. It's also socially unjust and regressive, but I would like to see those analyses and the trade-offs for a ton of emissions manifested as price, and let people learn the actual cost of these things going forward.
So is the government then, anybody can pick up on Ken's point here, certainly a carbon tax is a more explicit way of pricing carbon compared to these regulations. Most people understand that some regulation, if it's going to drive up the cost of your electricity by phasing out coal, will understand that. So how can a government that is committed to complementary policies also go some way down the road to let citizens know what the price tag is? Erin, why don't you address that?
Yeah, I'd just like to throw a few pieces into the mix and maybe to offer a counterpoint on whether or not governments are doing analysis, because frankly, I think that's very unfair. There are cabinet directives that require the federal government to produce very significant regulatory impact analysis statements when they do these types of things. They do that. Provinces have similar practices. So our governments are thinking really hard about how to get this right. As it relates to the point around undue economic costs, or really, we can't afford to hit our targets, I would just suggest the audience look at some research that we commissioned from Enviroeconomics. Dave Sawyer has crunched the numbers on what a package of achieving our targets via carbon pricing and the flexible regulations that Marc refers to. And he, in fact, finds that Canada's GDP is 1.4 times larger than it is today in 2030 in a scenario where we achieve our climate targets. And so, I think that there is quite a body of evidence that suggests we can do this in a way that works. We can build an economy that's more competitive in the long run, and we can give people the types of clean solutions that they're demanding.
All right. I think it's worth, just before you interject here, Marc, to point out some work that was done recently by the UN on the cost of not dealing with climate change. And I know this isn't a broad discussion about those issues, but as Ken raised it, I think it's important to note that action has a price, but so does inaction. Go ahead, Marc.
Well, actually, Sean, you and Erin have both just said what I wanted to say. Just basically in answer to Ken, there's different ways of asking people about things, and he's saying I want to ask them when they see the gasoline price as they drive down the street whether they want to do something about climate change, because they'll make that decision whether they get an electric car or keep paying for that gasoline price. And yeah, that's one way to ask the question, but in democratic societies we do it in different ways. And when we've asked, and with other kinds of policies, but likewise in climate policy, if we've asked people, big surveys I've seen, what do you think about your children's Canadian GDP being 3% lower in 2050 so that they don't have the following impacts from climate change, assuming we can get other countries to act? And they invariably say, yes, we want to act on that. So when you look at, are people willing to pay the cost to avoid that impact, and also the risks of catastrophic work, like Bill Nordhaus and other pretty conservative economists have been showing that. We get strong reasons why people do want this kind of action to happen.
All right, I think we're going to move now to the questions that have come in from viewers and listeners and over the web. Let's start with Nina, because from Ontario, who referred to something that came up earlier, but I don't think we really delved into. How do you think the pan-Canadian approach to carbon pricing will interact with a clean fuel standard that's currently under development by the federal government? We don't know the details yet of what that clean fuel standard will look like, but anybody want to take that on?
Well, just a quick point. So, and this is something we talk about in our report, that if the federal government is going to implement something like the clean fuel standard, which is a complementary policy, then I think we should think about how that policy is going to interact with the provincial carbon pricing regimes. And it's going to react or interact in different ways with a BC and Alberta style carbon tax than it will with an Ontario and Quebec style cap and trade system. And just to make this quick, a policy like that layered on top of the carbon tax is going to increase emissions reductions in BC and Alberta and add some cost, but it could be a well-designed policy, and probably is. In Ontario and Quebec, if it applies to the same emissions that the cap and trade system applies to, it won't actually, it'll just kind of shift around emissions in that system, it won't actually lead to additional emissions reductions, but it may actually increase costs. So that is kind of a weird outcome, and I think governments want to think about that. The other thing is, in a cap and trade system, especially linked to California, what it's probably going to do is lead to less purchases of permits from California and help to keep the price down. This may exacerbate price differentials across provinces, which has implications for pan-Canadian overall cost. So I think the clean fuel standard, while itself may be a good policy, we got to think carefully about how it interacts with the carbon price.
Ken, you wanted to get in, and then Marc?
Well, I think that's exactly right, which is if you have a proper carbon price, it will drive people to behave in ways that reduce the tax they pay on carbon, and therefore they'll buy lower carbon fuels. I do want to say, I think the whole cost of inaction thing is a bit of a canard, or a jacquard maybe in this case, because I don't think that, first of all, I don't think it's a meaningful concept. People adapt to changes in the climate every day. They will change as time goes forward. And with regard to things like rebuilding highways, I wrote a paper when I was working down in the States at the American Enterprise Institute. We could ameliorate most of the actual expected human impacts of climate change by conventional pricing policies, pricing our roads, fully pricing our electricity, fully pricing our water, fully pricing our risk. I happen to live right on the Elbow River, and I pay the premium for that because I have the risk. I would pay a lot more for insurance, but we should be doing those things that gradually shift society into a more resilient climate framework where we can adapt to the changes we expect. Let's be honest. The temperature change is not meaningful. I can go to Jamaica tomorrow where the temperature range is vastly different than here, and I'll be perfectly comfortable. In fact, I'll be on a beach with a Bahama mama. So it's not the temperature change, it's the water that's going to do it. It's the hydrological changes that are expected to cause real problems from climate change. And we can address those with normal hydrological control policies that we've had for 100 years. We know how to mitigate flood risk. We know how to mitigate drought risk. Water markets, for example, that would let people bring water in to areas where their snowpack isn't what it's supposed to be that year. We know how to mitigate all of those risks. So what I would argue for is inaction is meaningless. And I also don't like the counterfactual of, well, if we don't act, there's a cost to inaction, right? Well, we don't have an asteroid shield around the Earth. Right? We don't have one. We know 100% that the Earth will be slammed into by asteroids and by comets.
Okay, let's not do asteroids.
And we don't have.
So,
Aaron, take us away from asteroids.
Well, wait. Can I?
Yeah. One last point. This is the thing. Humans don't insure themselves that way for the worst case. We insure ourselves for what we think to be the average case. In all ways. Otherwise, you spend all of your income on your insurance.
All right, Aaron, you wanted to get in, and then Marc, please.
Sure. Well, so just to bring in the international context, because of course the Paris Agreement is subject to a lot of debate these days, and we're just one party to that agreement. Most of the world is also party to that agreement, and so to say that Canada can adapt is true. You know, we will spend quite a lot of our hard-earned money adapting our coastlines and making sure our communities can respond. It's good that we have the relative wealth to be able to make those kind of investments. It makes us very privileged in the global context. The Marshall Islands is not going to be able to say the same thing, and I think part of our interest in this conversation around climate action is ensuring that we are a good global citizen and ensuring that Canada is doing its fair share to avert disastrous outcomes, not just for ourselves, but for others around the world. One quick point that I would make on the clean fuel standard, because I did say off the top that we believe in the policy mix, but it is true that not anything should be considered as, there are upper limits on costs, and not everything goes. I think the federal clean fuel standard does run the risk of potentially exacerbating costs and exacerbating price differentials, as Chris referred to, in a way that is not in Canada's interest. So I'm happy to know that there are still quite a long time before that sort of policy is finalized, and there's many opportunities for folks on this call and in the audience to engage. But I think it's one of the most interesting policies in the Pan-Canadian framework, precisely because it's going to need really thoughtful design.
And Can I go now?
Yes, please. Marc.
Yeah, well, my intervention almost shouldn't count as an intervention because I'm not going to debate Ken on that issue of what we ought to be doing. I don't think it's part of this panel, but all I wanted to say, and Chris already gave a hint at that, I think this report of the Ecofiscal Commission is really good on that question that was posed. And I just really enjoyed, I mean, it was all concepts that I knew, Chris, but your writing team, you guys did a great job. So it was really fun to look at, okay, now under cap and trade, what happens with this kind of policy? Now under carbon tax. And I just really want to commend you on the report. I think you've got a document there that's really valuable for that big goal that you had, which was to help people sort out where there can be perverse effect, where these things work together or where they don't. So kudos for that. And you already, in answering this, gave a bit of that hint. It's not so simple when people think, oh, well, it'll have the same effect under carbon tax or cap and trade. So well done.
Thank you.
So let me pose another question from the audience, and this is from James, and it takes us in a bit of a different direction, but it's certainly sold under complementary policies, and that is the panelists' views on the merits of government investment, presumably, in clean technology R&D. Is that a complementary policy aimed at reducing emissions in Canada, or is that an industrial policy?
Both. Well, it may be both, that's right. It certainly would be a complementary policy. I think this is something that governments probably are going to want to do because this is the kind of thing that activist governments like to do, but I think they should do it very carefully. I think it is possible that public investments in new technologies, whether they're clean or otherwise, right, can actually help the development of those technologies. There are market imperfections that are well known that suggest that there is a need for some government provision, but you've got to do this carefully because it's very easy to waste a large amount of taxpayers' funds in investments that are, by definition, highly risky. So you want to make sure that you are doing this in a way that is more than arm's distance, I think, from the political process. You certainly do not want money given away higgledy-piggledy to friends here and there. So I think setting up things like SDTC, and I'm not claiming that SDTC is necessarily good, but I think it's probably in the ballpark of good in terms of dispersing public funds for kind of genuinely merit-based projects. So it's something that needs to be done carefully, I think, Sean.
All right. Someone else wants to, Ken?
Sure. So this is actually an area where we might find agreement. I've said and written before that the literature shows that the private sector tends to underinvest in research and development, particularly the most important kinds of research and development which we need to solve this problem, which is fundamental research, fundamental science. We are pushing the limits of our known physics with regard to energy storage, with regard to the efficiency of energy production, with regard to the efficiency of getting additional emission reductions. And we have a growing population and a growing world population, 2 billion people who have live in dire energy poverty. So I totally agree with Marc. I agree with what was said on the need to do this carefully. The distinction I make is really it stops at the university door. You don't go into the valley of death with investments in picking particular kinds of technology to subsidize R&D into. There's a reason it's called the Valley of Death. It's where bad ideas go to die. And it's not a place where you want to take your money and throw it onto those ideas. When they come out the other end, the market will adopt them. Before they go into the valley, there's a role. But in the valley, stay out of it.
Any other views on whether this is important complementarity to carbon pricing?
Yeah, so I'll just throw a couple ideas into the mix. I think a lot of what has been said is very sage advice. I mean, there is a question here of the type of research and development that we are potentially willing to invest in. And, Canada has a long history of buying down risk for key sectors that we think are strategic. think about the oil sands, think about aerospace. We have a long history of making these kinds of investments. I think that as it relates to climate change, we should be thinking about the economy of the future and not necessarily the one that we have today. The one that we have today does have significant subsidies already for fossil fuel production. The economy of tomorrow, and where we should potentially be earmarking those research and development dollars, is around some of the exact technologies, Ken, that you mentioned, thinking about things like storage so that we can ensure that we're bringing in other sources of electricity generation in a way that is predictable and reliable for people. So there's sort of a brown economy, green economy frame here that I think governments should be overlaying onto the question of research and development and other investments.
Can I just add that when you talk to people who are in the clean tech sector and you ask them what's the #1 way to energize their business model, they typically answer to me a carbon price. And let's not underestimate the extent to which a carbon price, well designed and rising over time, can really help the clean tech sector, because it just increases the demand for everything that they do.
Right. Let's wind up then where we started a little bit on vehicles, and it was a prominent part of the report, and I think maybe a controversial case study, certainly in Quebec it will be, on whether direct subsidies to purchasers make sense at the level that they're being paid, layered on top of other policies that exist. So how do we assess the optimal, if we want, in fact, I guess we open it up to complete agnosticism on whether we even want government to play in this role, but if we do assume government's going to play a role in encouraging decarbonization in the personal transportation sector, how do we construct the best policies to get there, in addition to if we're going to add on to carbon price?
Well, can I make a quick comment on the EV subsidies in Quebec?
Please do.
So the EV subsidies in Quebec suffer from a problem that many subsidies suffer from. Very often when you offer a subsidy, and it doesn't really matter what we're talking about, you end up paying somebody to do something, but you end up paying them for doing something they would have done anyway. And when that happens, you're not changing behavior, but you are certainly creating costs, partly because of the second point, which is you got to raise the money to finance those subsidies, and you're typically raising those finances with very distortionary taxes. And these are the two main reasons why subsidies tend to be expensive, and they lie within the analysis of our EV subsidies in Quebec. So you can conclude that those subsidies are very high cost and should be avoided, but you can still believe that it might be useful for governments to support that sector in some way. So for example, it might be a better policy for governments to directly support the building of the infrastructure and the recharging infrastructure than the actual direct support of subsidies to the consumers. Now, I'm not saying it is better, but you have to do that analysis. But to argue against these particular EV subsidies is not to argue that government should do nothing about this sector.
All right. We have a couple more minutes, so Ken, you wanted to jump in?
Sure, a quick comment. I agree with Chris on this to a certain extent. I've written, the very first op-ed I wrote was in 1985 in Los Angeles called "Pull the Plug on the Electric Car Mandate," and little has changed. I think what's necessary is an analysis of, if you want to decarbonize personal vehicles, the logical first step to me, it seems, given that the limitations of electric cars and the expenses, is we should be studying, what about natural gas infrastructure for fueling personal vehicles, right? Because move to natural gas away from oil, you'll get an immediate reduction. We have lots of it. We're awash in this stuff in North America. How can you make the case to me that better to take the gas, generate electrons, pump the electrons through wires, then put them into cars, as opposed to pipe the natural gas right into the car in flex fuel vehicles? So I'd love to see that analysis, and I think it's right. I also want to say that, point out that there's a fallacy here, which is the fallacy, what I call the fallacy of the static other, which was the same in 1995 as it is today. The assumption was made that we have to go to electric cars because internal combustion engines can't become more efficient and therefore less emitting. Well, that has proven to not be the case since electric cars were introduced in the late 1800s. Internal combustion vehicles have gotten more and more efficient over time, to the point that the incremental difference now between a new internal combustion engine and an electric car is much, much smaller than it was even 20 years ago. And that's likely to continue.
Running out of time. Let me give Marc a last one. I'm sorry, Aaron, but
No worries.
Marc, the
Yeah.
last word
So
here.
So Ken jumped around different things there. He talked about subsidies and was agreeing with Chris, and I agree with Chris on the issue of subsidies, and I've contributed a lot of research in that area. But then he jumped about electric vehicle mandates. So these are like the zero emission or low emission or partial zero emission mandates. And Chris, when you said, you know, I talk to people in the tech sector and industry and so on. Well, when I talk to people in the automotive industry in the 90s and 2000s and asked them, what drove you guys to develop the hybrid car? And then later on, even some advances in biofuel vehicles and then electric vehicles and work on hydrogen that, you know, may or may not pan out. And they said, oh, it wasn't a carbon price. They said it was a flexible regulation. And guess what that flexible regulation forced us to do? It forced us to put money into innovation to compete with each other. And then we had to compete for market share. And in trying to compete for market share, what we did is we charged, we actually did do subsidies. We did cross subsidies. We had to charge a slightly higher price for the gas guzzling vehicles in order to have a lower price so that we met our requirements for selling those other cars. And because there was some flexibility in how the California Air Resources Board played it out, later we were able to show them, look, we made great advances with hybrid sales and market penetration. Can we go a little slower on the pure battery electric because we're having more trouble technologically and in marketing? And they said, fine. And we got the same environmental outcome, but it wasn't a carbon price that did that. I'm sorry. What drove innovation technology was a mandate, but it needed to be as flexible as possible, at least for an economist like me, for that to happen.
All right, that's great. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for a very interesting and wide-ranging conversation. And I think people online will have learned a lot and given some food for thought. And certainly you all know where to find the report and do your own digging into it. Thank you again for this.
Thank you, Sean, Marc, Aaron, and Ken. Thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you all. Thanks, Chris, for the invitation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.